Welcome to Leaders and Laggards.
Welcome to episode 11 of Leaders and Laggards. I'm pleased to have Dave Swenson and Jeff Custer joining me tonight. And our topic tonight is going to be accountability. And so my first question going out is accountability. What does it mean to you?
What a great topic, I thought, Ken. And, I think in my own words, without looking up the dictionary definition, to me, accountability is we can count on each other to do what we said we were going to do. And, kind of like us getting together every week, I think we've done this. I can't remember what number you just said, but we've done this for a number of weeks. And, I think we've gotten to where we feel like we can count on each other to do our part. Yeah. And I think that to me is just kind of the base of accountability.
Dave, what are your thoughts?
Well, honestly, I don't use the word accountability very often in my practice. Generally, when we're talking about these kinds of things, the term I like to use is countability. And I know that's not a real word, but you can't let that stop you, right? So, and really how we define that with a group is we say the definition of countability is I have got to be able to count on you specifically when and where it really matters, right? So that means you're going to have to be competent. You're going to have a commitment to me. You're going to have to be consistent. And so, generally, I'll teach people how to measure that in a 360-degree fashion, and then kind of continually improve their accountability level. So I know accountability is not a word, but it's the one we use.
Maybe Dave, they'll add that to the dictionary and you put your picture by it.
I can't take the credit. I got it from John Maxwell, but I just like the term. So
yeah.
Either that or it'll show some of those little building blocks, and it's like, are these countable? So when you think of accountability and the definitions that you just both kind of used, how do you treat mistakes?
I think you have to treat a mistake as an opportunity to learn, right? You can't treat it as a failure. So maybe misalignment is a word I'd prefer over mistake, but when things happen that aren't expected, right? When things happen that weren't what you expected to happen, I think you got to take that as an opportunity to learn.
Yeah, and I would just, the only probably nuance I have to what Dave said is I would kind of come back to you and say, is the first time the mistake was made or the sixth time the same mistake was made? Yep. And probably my reaction and answer is different depending on which one of those we're talking about. Dave, I'm with you. If it's, people make a mistake, just because, they didn't know, or they weren't properly trained, or, maybe they had poor decision-making in something that happened.
Right.
Great, good learning opportunity. And I think good leaders can make or break people at that kind of critical moment. They make that mistake depending on how you as a leader respond to that person is probably going to set the tone for whether they're ever going to decide anything again. If you just berate them because they made a mistake, they're in their head, they're going to say, I'm not going to ever make a decision again, versus, if you come back at that person and say, okay, this happened. What did you learn from it? And a question I really like to teach leaders is, if you had this happen again, what would you do differently? That's kind of that learning question. And so I think that to me, Dave, is kind of the nuance is it a first time mistake or something that people just keep making the same one over and over again? And then probably you got to do something different in that case.
No, I agree with you. I would tend to say that if we get to a second and third time even, I'm probably missing the mark as the leader, right? Because there's some opportunities I missed for my accountability, right? I probably should have been interdicting in a different way. But if this is the first time, yeah, how can we learn from it? And one of the things we'd better learn is how it doesn't happen again, right?
I think one of the things in accountability to me means taking responsibility for your actions and doing what you said you were going to do. And also, we're all human and we make mistakes, and it's taking ownership for those mistakes and being straightforward. So what do you think about how it can't always be accountability for ourselves. Sometimes we have to be able to hold others accountable. How do you address accountability for others, and what is your approach?
I mean, I think at some point in time, we're probably talking about a point where we should be giving some feedback as a leader. If you think about why and when and how you give feedback, really you should only be giving it for two reasons, and those reasons are to either encourage more of that type of behavior or go to a corrective change the behavior kind of activity. And so, that's going to be my default. I'm going to be giving you feedback, but I'm also going to be, giving you feedback in a way that 8 out of 10 times you see me, I'm going to be giving you some kind of supportive feedback, so that the times that I come back and it's going to be corrective, well, that I'm not just beating up on you, and that I care about you, and it's probably going to mean more at that point.
Yeah, Ken, one of my favorite things, I've had this model on my bulletin board for years, is Stephen Covey's ladder of accountability. And I'm not sitting here looking at it right at the moment, but essentially it's like, 8 steps in this ladder. And the higher you are on the ladder, the more accountable you are for your decisions, for your actions, kind of the stuff we've just been talking about. And I think one effective thing I've found that works is talking to people about this, about accountability, and about this model of accountability before you're in the heat of the battle. And then when you do get into the heat of battle, it's like, okay, I love asking that question. Okay, where are you at on the ladder? You don't have to say, oh, you really did something wrong, or I'm going to hold you accountable. You ask the person to hold themselves accountable to you. Where are you at on the ladder? And one of my favorite employees of all time had that ladder of accountability in his bulletin board in his office, and he and we'd sit and talk about stuff. And I think, like a lot of times, probably all of us do, we find ourselves complaining about this or that. There's always something to complain about. And one of the things I most appreciated about him, even though he worked for me, after we'd sit and commiserate for a bit, he'd turn and point to that model and say, we're not very high on the ladder. We need to move up. I can't even tell you how much I appreciated having an employee like that he held me accountable. I was the boss, and he held me accountable. We did that because we had this agreement that here's this framework for accountability, and we both agreed to it. And when we catch each other not being accountable, we're going to call each other on it.
Yeah, and I know that I have a leadership membership group and I asked this question recently, and one of the things that we talked about was that it really is about communications. And that if the team all agree to the actions that need to be taken, then it becomes about team accountability, and that will drive personal accountability.
Yeah.
And as a leader, I think it's important that you get that consensus within whatever the parameters and the guide rails or guardrails are for the situation that you're under.
Yeah.
Well, one last question on what does accountability mean to you is sometimes accountability has a negative connotation. How do you address that in the environment of a team? Jeff, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I think you have to start really at maybe the core of, as a team, we want to be successful. And here's the objectives we have in our organization that we think that we hit these objectives, we're gonna say we're successful, and each one of us has our role to play in that, and we rely on each other to do our own role. And if somebody fails, we're going to struggle to be successful. One of my boys always uses this example when we get talking about this. Is you think of a sports team, and in particular, he was a good football player. And you have 11 players on the field, and they all have different roles, but they have the same objective as a team to win the game. And you have to trust that your teammate next to you is going to do their job the way they're supposed to, and you do yours the way you're supposed to. and you have a good chance to succeed if you do that. If you're that player and you're doing your job, but you know that your teammate next to you, you don't trust that they're going to get their job done, all of a sudden you start forgetting about what you're supposed to do, and you're trying to compensate for what they're supposed to do, and pretty soon nobody's doing what they're supposed to do. And I just think it's a good analogy for organizations, that people have to ha- play their role, and we have to be able to trust each other that we're going to do what we're supposed to do. And I think that's really, to me, kind of the root, I think, Ken, of your question.
When we're talking about a negative connotation or a negative impact, perceived negative impact, generally it's because, the feedback, the accountability feedback is a surprise. Right. And so one of the things that I will always teach clients is feedback should never be a surprise, right? You ought to be doing one-on-ones, you ought to be doing check-ins. And really at the point where you're giving feedback, it should really just kind of be a confirmation. But, if we don't have alignment up front, right? If we're not bought in up front, right? That tends to be why things don't get done. I mean, if we get passionate about something, right? If our whys are the same, for instance, right? Whatever it is that we're working on is in direct alignment with what it is that I want to get done and who I think I am as a person, I'm probably going to be pretty fired up about getting it done, and I'm likely not going to let things slide. But generally, my experience has been when it gets negative, it's because somebody dropped the ball along the line with following up with folks, and now the accountability, it could be perceived as a surprise.
And I know when I was discussing this earlier, one of the things we talked about is that there's roles and responsibilities, and then there are accountabilities really about results. And so one of the things, and especially if there's a negative connotation, and there was about 5 of us that were part of the discussion, and only one of the 5 had ever used, or their organization was using a RACI diagram to try and differentiate and define what's the difference between a role, a responsibility, and an accountability for the task or the activity. And so that's for our listeners, that's a tool that can be used to really help be intentional about identifying roles and accountability. Second question I had is leader motivation. How do you stay motivated in your role and activities? And I'll annotate that with, especially if your team is not engaged. So, kind of start off, I'm going to go with you first, Dave, start off with just in general, but then if your team's not engaged, how do you change your behavior in order to stay motivated or to try and remotivate the team?
It's all about why you're there, right? Motivation comes from feeling like you're part of something that you're aligned with. So if I hate what it is that we're doing, I'm probably not going to be super motivated and or engaged. So I need to be honest with myself as an employee that what it is that I'm signed up for, I actually am in alignment with. And from a leader's perspective, you need to know how to fish. You need to understand your team, right? So it shouldn't be a surprise to you if someone on the team is not aligned. There's going to be behaviors they're going to display that are going to let you know this person's not feeling it.
Jeff?
Yeah, Dave, that was what I started my list with, is your why.
Right.
And I quickly go to a question I've asked myself a lot over the years. I think it's a good question for people to ask. What do you really want? And I was, Ken, looking at this question, maybe stepping back even more out of the organization, just as it personally is, what do you really want? And you can apply it to the organization. What as a leader, what do you really want? And I think once you kind of drill down into your values and you tie goals to those underlying values, now you have some pretty strong motivation, because you know why you want to go where you want to go. And if you've not thought about that, if you're not really sure about that, one of the exercises I've done, you can get a couple different things called a values card sort. You can actually buy these online.
Yep.
And done this exercise, and think it's really helpful for people that are trying to pin down what are those core values that really help them determine their why. And if people are interested in that, get a hold of one of us, because we could help with running you through one of these values card sorts to kind of help you pin that down.
Right.
I always kind of think this, if people, think about New Year's resolutions. Most New Year's resolutions last a couple days, couple weeks, and you kind of say, well, why is that? And I think two things. One, they're poor goals. They're not well thought out goals. And I also say, I don't think they're tied to those underlying values. So if you know those values, Dave, I'd say that's your why. And then you build your goals on that. You're going to find out why you do what you do.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that goes along with that is your why might change.
Yep.
If you're early on in your career, your why might be very self-motivated.
Sure.
Yeah.
And then you get maybe into a mid-career, maybe you have a family or your family's family, and you get more into a teaching or a coaching mode, and that's really what is partially motivating you. And then as you get where I would say the three of us probably are, as you get into the later stages, and it's really about helping others succeed, and it's more people oriented. So your why is not necessarily, I think your core values will stay pretty constant.
Yeah.
But I think that your why can change with where you are in your life cycle and in your experience cycle.
And Ken, I'll give you a specific example of mine. One of the values I've got it written down, I've had it for years, is I am an effective father. That's my deep value. And under that, I always had this kind of sub bullet of I discipline my children with love. Well, the youngest is 21 now. And so I left it on the list, but I crossed it out because it's not my role anymore. I still want to be an effective father, but that's not my role. Now my role is to give them wise counsel. And so, I think that's a specific example that how I've actually applied that principle that you just said.
And I think sometimes it's important to, as an organization might change or their engagement might change on a project or whatever, an initiative that you're working on, understanding why it changed and being adaptable and being able to pivot is an important aspect as well. So the last question I have is, what advice would you provide for when negative feedback is received? And to me, again, we talked about the negative connotation sometimes of accountability, but there are going to be times when there's negative feedback. What advice would you give?
Yeah, I started, Ken, with an assumption that the negative feedback was delivered in an appropriate way, which might be a big assumption, right, Dave?
That's an assumption, yes.
And I think if you're and I was thinking at it in the role of receiving that negative feedback, but I think I would ask clarifying questions. So if you're, if things aren't clear, Dave, you talked about this a little bit earlier. If things aren't clear, I'm going to ask maybe to clarify things to make sure I really understand what the behavior was that's being told that was negative. Then I'm probably going to leave that with the thought of, I'm going to really want to assess that feedback to, in my own head, decide, is that really valid? And kind of weigh that out. And I think, if you say, yeah, I think it is, I think they have a point there. I think it's like, okay, if it is warranted, I'm going to commit to change. And probably the last step is to follow up back with that person after some period of time, just to say, hey, what do you think? Am I doing better now? Like those are kind of some general steps I think that I'd probably go through, Ken.
Dave?
Yeah, for me, and I'll just go on the assumption that I'm receiving the negative feedback and not giving it, right? But let's assume that that's the case, and I'll just come out and say I am definitely my biggest critic. And a long time ago, got to be 15 years ago, I started keeping a personal plus delta every day because I want to continually improve my approach. And so when I look at some of those early plus deltas versus the things that I'm writing today, it seems almost like I'm an entirely different person. But but it's back to, I don't care whether I'm giving the feedback or I'm receiving it. It shouldn't be a surprise. Right. So if I'm receiving corrective feedback, then, and if I missed it, right, then I've got some work to do on my end. Where was I off the bubble? Because obviously I'm receiving something I didn't expect. And so, I'm going to want some clarity out of the person. But at this point in time, I'm looking myself in the mirror and saying, well, you missed something. Now, if I'm going to have to give corrective feedback and there might be a negative perception about the feedback that I'm giving, again, it's probably because I didn't give enough positive feedback along the way. I didn't give enough of that supportive feedback along the way. And the surprise is because the one time that I've come and talked to this person, I'm telling them that something needs to change, right? It's not supporting. And so I'm probably going to, I'm less likely to walk into a honey pot at this point. I'm more likely to walk into a bee's nest. Yeah. Again, that cardinal rule I live by is that feedback shouldn't be a surprise.
Yeah, Dave, how many times have you seen it where that happens at a year-end review?
When that's the only time you've talked to somebody the entire year, and now we're having that year-end review.
Yep.
Yeah,
I know I have to say I'm not a big fan of year-end reviews. If you're giving feedback throughout the year, you shouldn't have to do a final wrap up of a review. And again, I think, to what Dave was saying, is no surprises. And I think you both alluded to this earlier, is that, you need to be able to, if you are receiving the negative feedback, is what are you going to do differently and what have you learned from it?
Yep.
And if you're giving the negative feedback, it's got to be about the behavior and what you saw, and it can't be personal. So Dave, any closing thoughts on accountability for our listeners?
I think the closing thought would be, think about the term of accountability and some of the conversations we've had here tonight, and just realize that this is probably something you should be being proactive with. So, if it's a team-based environment, make sure you've done your due diligence up front and everybody understands what's expected. And on top of that, what you're expecting of yourself and committing to as part of the team. And, I can't say it strongly enough, the impact it's had on me, continually improving myself through giving myself feedback and accountability to be better each and every day. Right. I would recommend that if you're not already tracking those kinds of things, start keeping a journal, right? It doesn't have to be long, but what are 3 to 5 things that you kind of expected to happen or that you're okay with happening over the course of the week? And where are the opportunities over the course of the week? I think that goes a long way.
Jeff?
Yeah, taking off on what Dave just said, a little bit of self-reflection and self-awareness, I think, can go a long way here, in that finding out if you struggle with accountability in some area. So I'm thinking more of myself. I struggle in some area, be self-aware, understand, okay, I struggle with this, and come up with a strategy. Dave, I love your strategy, of journaling. That's a great strategy. And I just share a personal strategy that has worked really well for me. Is I've had this personal goal about riding an exercise bike 150 minutes a week. And last year I just struggled for a whole bunch of reasons. You know how that goes.
Yeah.
And I was so frustrated with myself, and I've got actually a financial advisor I work with, but he's kind of a little more than a financial advisor. And we were talking about this at the end of the year, and he offered to basically be my accountability partner. This probably sounds silly to people listening, but every day when I'm done riding the bike now, I take a picture of the little screen that says how much I did, and I text that to him. And I know every day, Ken, he's waiting for that text. And if I don't send it to him, he'll sometimes text me and just ask how I'm doing. Yeah. And so it's similar to Dave's journaling. I think I just encourage everybody to figure out what works for you in those areas where you may struggle with accountability, and find that method to help you, because other people can help you, as well as journaling where you're helping yourself.
And I think you both stole my thunder for the closing statement I had. And again, so all I'll say is I really do believe that accountability is mostly about self-reflection, and whatever method you choose to use to self-reflect to help you be a better person and do what you said you were going to do. that's what it's all about. So thank you, everybody, for participating and listening to our Leaders and Laggards.
Thanks for watching, and remember, leadership matters.